So I think our audience is trying to figure out what is an entrepreneurial CFO. Let's start with just the CFO. Liaan, if you'd allow me, can we speak to your career progression of how you became a CFO?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Good afternoon, everybody. I am a chartered accountant by training. I did my articles at KPMG. After that, my wife and I spread our wings. We went across to the UK, joined KPMG there as well, and somehow kind of lucked into a job, shall I say, at McLaren. So that's where my journey in the automotive industry started. It wasn't always a goal of mine, but it just so happened. I worked in the head office and the group reporting side of that business. After a while, we spent 4 years in the UK, returned to South Africa, moved into a job with Volvo on the construction equipment side. And actually, I suppose the job came looking for me rather than I went looking for the job.
That's awesome.
I think for me, it was a case of I had that ambition and that drive to want to become a CFO and a finance director. So I was looking for the opportunities, but really this one was being in the right place at the right time and having relevant experience in my industry in my case.
So today we're talking about the entrepreneurial CFO. I'm going to ask our sound desk to close one of those doors for us. And before I move on to Sizwe, I just want you to think about the term entrepreneurial, someone who's creating something. And then I'm going to come back to you on the concept of the entrepreneurial CFO.
Okay.
Sizwe, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Your journey, who's Sizwe and how did he become the CFO of Phembani?
Thank you, Didi. Good afternoon, everyone. As Didi has said, my name is Sizwe Nkosi. I'm the CFO at Phembani. In terms of my career, I come from a small town called Newcastle, in a small township called Matadeni. That's where I did my matric. And then luckily I got, at that time, a bursary from Anglo. And then I went through Natal, qualified as a CA. And then I went back to Anglo, but in fact I went back to De Beers, worked for De Beers. And from there I went down to KZN, worked for Fosco, and then I worked for Investec. And then I decided to go a bit rogue. I tried the entrepreneurial route, where I started a business of my own. But I think it just became a bit difficult. I was based in Durban at that time. Okay. In fact, I worked for Investec in Durban. And then, that was probably around 2006. The whole craze around the mining rights, prospecting right, mining charter. Mm-hmm. So I joined one of the guys here in Joburg who had some mining properties up in the Waterberg. So we went through an entrepreneurial route up until 2011. When I left him, and then I joined Metma Trading, or okay. Metma Group. It was a listed entity. I was a CFO, so that's when I became CFO for the first time. Okay. In my previous, where I was entrepreneurial, I was looking after all the financial issues, so I was more commercial, more CFO. So I joined Metma Group as a CFO, so listed entity, and then we sold Metma in 2015, sold it to a company called Traxys, because of the whole, commodity cycle. Things were not looking great, and funding was drying up, especially for commodities traders. So we sold the company to an American company called Traxys, and then at that time, did the same thing again. I just didn't have anything to do, and then until I joined Phembani. Okay. Initially Shanduga, just before it became Phembani. Okay. So now I'm the CFO there. I've been there now since 2015.
Thanks for that.
Thanks.
Great, welcome back.
Thank you.
Different topic this time.
Yeah.
Would you be so kind as to let us in and know a brief history of yours?
Sure. So born and bred in Johannesburg, did my articles at KPMG. Was very well trained by many of the partners that were implicated in the scandal. I worked for most of them, so don't expect much. I worked for none of them. So I enjoyed my time there. I met my wife at school who also went the chartered accountant route at KPMG. We were seconded to the US, at the time of 9/11. They only opened up 2 secondments at that period because of those terror attacks, and we were fortunate to get that. We lived there for 6 or 9 months, came back after 11-hour days for 4 months. I said I'd never audit anything ever again. So I decided to get out of audit. Basically landed up at Discovery straight after that, pretty much. Worked for 3 years there in the group finance area, and then was just quite fortunate with people leaving and circumstances, and got the CFO of the health division 12 years ago, and I've been in that role since then, now running some of their operational units as well as that. That's me.
Thanks very much for
pleasure.
those intros, gents. So when we think entrepreneur, we think someone who thinks out of the box, someone who's brave, someone who's willing to create something, and something that has longevity and will last, whatever that product or service is. Liaan, I said I'm going to come back to you with the concept of an entrepreneurial CFO, somebody who's really different from the crunching numbers guy, can still do the work really well, but is creative. How do you think in your role at Land Rover, you've had opportunities to be an entrepreneurial CFO?
So I think it's an odd concept oftentimes because in corporates we don't associate entrepreneurial with a corporate sort of environment because we're quite sometimes narrow-minded in our thinking that an entrepreneur is somebody that kind of goes this rogue like Alan Ray's who's next door, goes that direction. But I think there's an opportunity to have entrepreneurial traits or to act in an entrepreneurial way wherever you are. So some of the things that we, for instance, have looked at is we've recently concluded an offshoring of some of our more, call it, routine activities in terms of processing and those sorts of things. I think, Brett and their business are absolute leaders in terms of that. But for us, that was a bit of a game changer, and it's something that we were the first in the group within Land Rover to lead with in terms of creating that. We didn't do that necessarily to kind of remove resource or anything. We did that so that we can start freeing up the hands of the people around us to support the wider business more with what we call value-add activities. So proper analysis, business partnering, decision-making support. That's the one side of it. I think the other side of it is an entrepreneurial CFO, I think in my mind, is somebody that's willing to have a go. And willing to have a go with their operational partners. So sometimes, sales and finance don't often sit around the same table, and I think it injects a level of conflict. But I think an entrepreneurial CFO is somebody that's willing to listen and willing to listen to that proposal, and even if it sounds fairly outlandish, have a go at it. So we launched, for instance, in South Africa, about 24 months ago, a product called GFV, Guaranteed Future Value. Now, we weren't first to market with that, but once again, within the Jaguar Land Rover group, we were one of the first subsidiaries to do that. Okay. And the intention is that understanding that the market's in a tough space, we wanted to create a product that we could take to market that lowers those hurdles of affordability for our customers, because we realized that was an issue. And that's one of those things where you can either look at it and go, oh, there's massive risk involved in this, because you're standing in for a guarantee, or you go, yes, there's risk, but let's try and balance this up and see how it opens up for the business and opportunity.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that guaranteed future value example slightly later, but let me go and ask Sizwe, you have had to be brave, and at points you've been brave by just going into different opportunities. What is an entrepreneurial CFO in your eyes?
Yeah, I think it is an interesting question if you think about it, because if anyone talks about a CFO, you're thinking reporting, you're thinking internal controls, you're thinking risk management. But whilst you're thinking about those areas, most of the time a CFO is part of a executive, and is second in charge, and basically he's the guy who has to probably initially craft with the CEO the strategy and then implement that strategy. So I suppose it starts there in terms of saying, what is the strategy of the company? Where do we want to go to? And most companies anyway, their main purpose is to grow shareholders' wealth. But the thing is, in a business environment, there are risks. in a business environment, there are changes. For example, in my view, and an entrepreneurial CFO, I think the most important thing has to be adaptable.
Okay.
He has to be able to adapt to change.
Okay.
There are many kind of factors. For example, the markets change, the economies change, government changes their policies and regulations. Even the companies themselves, profitability change because of seasonality. Mm-hmm. And an entrepreneurial CFO is always then looking out for further opportunities to be able to grow the company and return and make sure that it returns that shareholders' wealth. I think from an opportunities point of view, it's basically from a CFO point of view, is that how then do you source and how do you then make sure that those opportunities are implemented? And opportunities, I don't mean, for example, in my case where I am at Phembani, we are an investment holding company, so we look for transactions, for deals, we invest in companies. Mm-hmm. It's not only limited to that. Mm-hmm. Firstly, you can start in your own business environment and look at within your processes or within your products first and say, how do we make sure that these products are still relevant given the economic climate, given the potential changes that might be brought on by things like your downgrade, your ratings downgrade, if that's the case. But the thing is, the company is not stable. So also your products, you need to be able to make sure that you adapt. You look more for opportunities in areas which are returning high growth. Usually things like your technological areas, and if you try and link yourself to that, you can also look into high growth economies, and especially, South Africa at the moment, as we know, economic growth is not there, but other countries, up north, they are seeing some good economic growth, but the issues there is that there are challenges as well. There are issues of country risk, political risk, and issues such as, for example, currency weaknesses, currency. Some of the countries, the ability to repatriate currency. We know that in other countries. So basically, as an entrepreneurial CFO, you need to be able then to basically have that eye for opportunities. They usually say that...
Sizwe, I want to interrupt you just for a few seconds because you spoke on very good topics there that I'll come back to. Firstly, we'll look at mitigating those risks, and you started off with change. But I just want to speak to Brett and say to him, when Sizwe started, he spoke about being flexible, to be able to adapt. 12 years, but...
Yeah, long time.
In that role, a lot has been changing at Discovery. The things that you had on the app that you have now, that you formerly didn't have, that's just one technological advancement that Sizwe spoke about. Tell me about your 12 years as a CFO and how you tried to incorporate building things and being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, so I think, for me, I try and put words together. What is an entrepreneurial CFO? I think most, if not all, CFOs are entrepreneurial. Okay. I just think we frame ourselves in a way that isn't that. We just seem, but they actually are. So to me, it's never, you're an entrepreneurial. You're part of running a business. Mm-hmm. And if you look, I don't know what the stats are now, but I think Psycho produced them last year, that, 40% of the top 50 companies or 100 in the country was run by CAs. So there is this qualification profession that makes us entrepreneurs. So for me, it's just about one thing, and I gauge an entrepreneur by the way they think, and how I judge that is if I get a feeling that they sense this is their business. So whenever I manage or mentor someone, I say, think differently. Think of your role as if you were the owner of this business, because then you think differently. And that's what it is for me, because people, when you own something and it's yours, you think very differently than just being employed in it. And I use a very simple example to my staff around that, is saying, like, when you have kids, or when I had kids, I didn't have to wake up in the morning and go, okay, I want the best for them, and let me do this or do that. It just becomes naturally because they're yours, and you want to guide and give the best for them. And I said, now think like that about the business. Change your thinking. Change your thinking from an employee mindset to an owner mindset. So when you come here, you might not be the owner, but you make different decisions when you're thinking you're the owner. And that's the type of attitude I've tried to foster over the years. And it makes doing and coming to work exciting, because there's opportunities, there's projects you can work on. You've got to make sure that your key role is done. But once that's done, it's exciting. There's so much scope for a CFO.
And I think that the mindset you're talking there is about accountability and responsibility, and it also it sets your employees apart. You can see the maturity in the individual and the want to be a part of that institution. So, Liaan, when we started, you spoke about at some point, I think your competitors might call it agility, and it's called different things in different vehicle houses. But you had to go into guaranteed future value, which isn't necessarily something one would associate with your brand. One can look at what Sizwe was speaking about, the risk that you might face there, because the vehicle's going to come back within the said terms of the contract. What state does the vehicle come back in? Do you get your value for money? Is it profitable at some point to the vehicle lender or lessor, or is it lessee, and is it for the lessor? So let's just speak about that change, and how was that change received when you incorporated that?
Well, first of all, I think you can come and do my job, because you've pitched that perfectly in terms of everything that needs to be considered. But yeah, it's a new space for the automotive industry to move into. I mean, yes, some of the bigger companies and our bigger competitors, have their own finance houses and scale-wise are in a different space, and have been doing financing. But getting into what is akin to a leasing sort of model is not something that the automotive industry, at least in South Africa and at least in the premium space, has really been known for. But as I said, the challenge that we have is with declining growth, limited sort of disposable income, those accessibility, affordability hurdles became higher. So it was one or two things, and I remember last year, I think there was a topic that said adapt or die. It was basically that for us, adapt or die. So either we do something differently to continue to make the sales and get the customers through the door, or we continue with our own kind of, not outdated, but same model, but we are gifting customers away to our competitors who are offering that product. So you have to look at it from various angles. And I mean, I think the thing for me is I'm not the expert when it comes to that on every single angle, but I can see holistically what the opportunity is, and I can see holistically what the risks are. And I think it's about getting the right people around the table. It was about considering what is the upside to the business if we do this, and what's the downside if we don't. How do we mitigate and control? You mentioned that is the car within the parameters, is the car in the right state, those sorts of things. So you define those risks up front, and you define how you can control them up front, and then you have a go. I think Brett touched on it in terms of it's a mindset. I think being an entrepreneur is a mindset. It's about thinking differently and thinking innovatively, regardless of the environment that you find yourself in. And I think that's what we try to do with Guaranteed Future Value.
And how was the change received within the institution?
Honestly, I think depending on whichever model of car you are talking about, some are more successful and some are less successful. And again, there's a learning in that. It's understanding, there's certain parts of the market that are more price sensitive, who are a lot more open to something like a guaranteed future value. And then somehow, as you migrate up the model range, then the customer seems to be less price sensitive, and guaranteed future value doesn't really appeal. So your Range Rover Sport and Range Rover customer really doesn't want a guaranteed future value, or isn't that much into it. But the customer buying a Discovery Sport, buying an E-Pace, someone that's maybe a bit more price sensitive, the product is spot on for them.
And do you make your cars, do you have a plant within the country, or are you importing?
We import 100% from the UK. We also import from the EU now with a new plant that has gone up in Nitra in Slovakia.
Okay.
So we don't manufacture here, unfortunately. Brexit is something that doesn't
Affected you?
keep me entrepreneurial. It keeps me freaking awake at night because I don't know which way we're heading, and it's a big risk for us, for our business, so we're trying to mitigate.
Okay.
But yeah, that's where we are.
The reason that I ask you that is because Sizwe touched on different kinds of risks. I want to bring you to currency risk.
Yes.
Because our currency is not so competitive with where your vehicles are made. How have you circumvented working at a loss?
So that's been an interesting journey. So whilst our currency risk, our currency risk is controlled between ourselves and our group company, they look at the number at the end and they require a certain return in sterling, and that number doesn't change. So as the currency depreciates, so we've had to find innovative ways to drive costs down. On our marketing journey, for instance, we have taken a decision to be deliberately more digital. So we are digital and mobile first, rather than necessarily being out there. And you'll see less of Jaguar Land Rover on what we call out of home, so big billboards and that sort of thing. But hopefully, and please come and tell me if it's not, you are getting served digital ads when you are on your digital journey online. So cutting costs, being more efficient with that. We've had to take some level of pricing as well, and we've tried to counteract it with things like GFE. But I suppose it's a case of pulling very different levers to ultimately, in small ways maybe, affect the result that adds up to a better return at the end of the day.
And are you still profitable?
We are still profitable, yes,
Praise
thankfully.
the Lord.
Yes. If you can say that in today's economy, then that's a big win. That's a tick.
Lovely. Sizwe, I want to come back to you because you spoke about various elements of your work life, and one of them was having to dabble within mining, and now Phembani does several types of investments with holding into different derivatives, so to say, underlying assets. You spoke about political risk, and you know South Africa has high political risk. How have you, in an entrepreneurial way, found ways in the instruments that you've created for your clients, found opportunities to stay profitable?
Yeah, I think that question is an interesting question, because firstly, how we do things. I'll just keep it within our business.
Okay.
Is that we set an investment criteria in terms of what we look at and what we don't look at, and then secondly, of the existing investments, we set a certain kind of also performance criteria in terms of meeting certain hurdle rates and stuff. And the thing is then in our environment, then it's all about basically making sure that you have the right investments that are able to provide you with that return. What that means is that at certain points, you might have a certain level or a certain number of investments giving you a certain value, but within that range, you might have investments that are not performing, and you have to take that decisions to basically dispose them in order to release that cash to be able then to put it into other ventures, which might be basically more more meeting whatever hurdle rate that you've set yourself. Another thing as well is that sometimes, because of the fact that, our funding models depend on a mixture of equity and debt, sometimes you enter funding transactions at the wrong time, or probably you enter funding transactions on certain investments that then, given where the economic climate is, or the changes within the economy, we find that they're not viable anymore, and basically you have to then exit them. Sometimes you have to sell your company silver because of the fact that maybe certain funding models of certain funding structures or facilities are much more expensive than what probably the company can generate to make sure that you meet the profitability criteria. So it's all about basically just looking at your portfolio each time and seeing how can you then make sure that your portfolio is performing in order to make sure that you get the performance that has been set. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think you've answered me quite well. You sound like the entrepreneurial CFO who's a fireman.
I think you constantly look, because you look at the environment, you look at the industries. we are limited to 4 areas or 4 platforms that we can invest in, which are basically, 2 are regulated and the other 2 are not necessarily regulated. We like to play in the regulated space because, within the regulated space, there are BEE opportunities, if I can put it that way, which then provides, opportunity to ensure that you can fund transaction in a much more friendlier way. So you look for those, you try and create value out of those, and then at the right time you have to exit so that you can release cash and put it more into other assets, which at that time they look like they are more kind of they have a better return.
Thank you for that. I'm going to come back to you on that BEE point, but Brett, I want to touch on the successes of technology. I see you're wearing an iWatch, and there's various technologies that have made discovery become much more profitable. The other day I went to a switch class, and I didn't have any devices on because switch, you move from different stations and have various exercises. But Discovery's board was there, and you just needed to put in your ID number, your initials, and your surname, and you got your vitality points. Let's talk about the technology and how you as a CFO have been part of the strategy to make sure that you're profitable.
Yeah, so I think, one of the pros of being a CFO is that you get to see how this all plays out and be part of the decision making when it comes to spending on technology. But you also have to be open to take a bit of risk on investment, which is often quite challenging for most CFOs. So you've got to be prepared to trust your leadership and look a few years ahead and actually invest in this technology. And I think, what helps in our business is that we try and separate the 2 sides of the brain. So we have the innovative people just working on innovation and the ops people just working on operations. So being part of both of those worlds as a CFO, it gives you a lot more comfort. So on a Friday, our CEOs go and meet with our lab where they just throw ideas out. Those come back into the business and we work with them. So I think it's been able to, just trust business, and you're not going to get every decision right, but being able to be part of that process. And I think, that's the fun part, technology, changing the products for the clients, that's where you want to be. But I'm going to go back to the point I made earlier, is that, you still got to tick all your boxes as a CFO. So if you've done that and the CEO trusts you can do that, that's when it opens up the doors. So you can't neglect your other responsibilities, and that's what frees up an entrepreneurial CEO.
So, gents, when we were preparing for this chat, we spoke about how the CFO can have a much bigger impact than within the institution. Let's speak about entrepreneurship within the South African context. Let's talk about SMEs. How do micro businesses get assisted by large corporations to be able to establish themselves? How does the entrepreneurial CFO meet the entrepreneurs? Who'd like to grab that one?
I'll attempt. I'm sure they'll do a better job than I can. I think I'm a very firm believer that you need to start looking in the space that you are in, rather than trying to go and reinvent the wheel completely. So Jaguar Land Rover trying to go and meet somebody that's in the healthcare industry and trying to work in that just doesn't work. There's not a synergy there. But we have lots of services that are rendered maybe not directly to us, but to our retailer network on a national basis. Some of those things we control and some of them we don't. And I think as a CFO and understanding what it needs and takes to build a business and to run a business, I think there's a couple of things that you can do. You can actively direct your company's purchasing direction towards smaller businesses or to businesses that are starting up. Oftentimes you might need to kind of step in with some funding support. Maybe you do that. And I mean, we have a couple of small examples of that, not big examples, but, after the end of every service intervention, you want your car back clean. that car has to be washed and has to be cleaned, and that's a job. It's a small business in and of itself.
Right.
So go and look for that opportunity to outsource that to somebody who started up,
A car wash
and who
business.
then employs a couple of people. And
Yeah.
that's what I mean. Don't go and look for things that are far off. Look for things that are quite near. Support with funding, and I think also invest in terms of mentorship. Another thing where we try and invest in, and it's also because it's aligned to our business, is in apprenticeships. We've got a very strong apprentice program.
Okay.
It beautifully works with our business because the next level of technicians are coming up through that. But oftentimes, and I know this is going to sound contradictory, but many of those guys don't stay with us. They actually leave after they've been trained the business. And we know this, it's part of our business cycle, so we accept that. But they leave our business to go and set up their own businesses and start their own businesses.
Great.
And I think in that way, it also supports that journey.
Yeah, I think it's a bit hard on your pocket because you invested these people and they go.
It
But
is.
I think to the economy, we have then skilled people who become mechanics.
There's a bigger interest in the way that
Yeah.
you are serving, and there's a cost that you're accepting as a result of that.
Thanks for that. Sizwe?
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example.
Okay.
Back in 2006, there was one gentleman who had just completed his IT degree. We basically wanted to start a business, and we took him along. And in fact, not 2006, 2007, when I joined that, when I became an entrepreneur myself.
Okay.
And we took him along, and he provided the service as from a desktop IT point of view. And then within the space of 4 years, because of our support, firstly, we had to provide him with an office, because even though he wasn't working for us, he was working for his own company. So basically, incubation services to allow him to grow. Provided him with, he had access to our boardroom, and as well to our receptionist and our number. So he grew from that. In that, he was capable, and he managed to make sure that our systems, our IT systems, were working as intended.
Okay.
And then he started getting other clients. To date, he's got big clients. I took him along to Phembani firstly, but he's got other clients, like for example, like Anchor Capital.
Okay.
He used to have Attack. He's got the Mosepe Foundation. But basically, we made sure we provided him even in the months where he needed an advance.
Okay.
In terms of services that he provided.
Okay.
We gave him the advance. We also advertised him to other companies. For
Which is
example,
great.
in the company that I was at Medma, I brought him along there. And, we were with
plugging
Anchor
him in.
Capital. We spoke to Anchor that we've got a good guy. In fact, even where I am, we've got different companies in the building that we're at. We're trying to get him into basically providing services to others.
To the other institutions.
His cost is low. His strategy is very good. He takes students that have just come out of varsity and which are very strong technically.
Okay.
But from his point of view, from a cost point of view, they're not that expensive. So he tends to keep our cost very low. So in a way, he's providing good service, but at a reasonable price. And we've given him coaching where we could. He's met basically, wherever I was, our CEO, our chairman, giving him guidance. So I think the thing is, it's a reality in this country, and in fact, in Africa and in all the emerging countries, SMEs is the way to go in order to be able to try and resolve the issue of unemployment, to try and resolve the issue of poverty. The current model of big corporates, going into small places like townships, trying to do business there. It has its own successes, but to be able to make sure that you service those areas properly, you need to do that in a model which is specific, which can be able to provide various sites, within a specific area, to be able then to
Expand.
to expand, but to alleviate poverty, to make sure that people within those areas are employed.
Yes. Thank you for that.
And as well for, they will provide the service or whatever product at very, very reasonable cost, because of the fact that they don't have this huge overhead structure.
Right.
So supporting SMEs, it's something that we do all the time. I've just given you an example, but there's various others that we
I think
support.
I'm jealous of this young man. He's well networked because of you. Brett, a point where you've seen SMEs being assisted by Discovery.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, Adrian, being an entrepreneur and a startup, is very passionate about helping small businesses. He sits on a lot of panels and he's part of Business Unity and all the big panels to grow employer growth. Where we haven't particularly focused, or we focus, but where we've really invested in is more along employee growth.
Okay.
So where we've invested quite heavily now, which is something the President has done very well, is the YES Fund, the Youth Employment Scheme, where so we've, I think, employed over 100 people. So you're giving them skills. So, for example, in our insure businesses where even if we can't employ them, so like we use Tiger Wheel as a partner, we get them employed there, and we pay for it. I think it's about a 60,000 Rand a year cost per person. And you give them a full year's apprenticeship, and then there's no obligation to bring them back into your business, but you can, which is hope, but you're giving them skills. So that's really where our focus is now. So, you know, really get people skilled and jobbed, and I think hopefully that'll be quite successful. Not that SMEs are not important, it's just really where we focus on job creation.
Yes, understandably. I'm going to see if there's anyone in the audience that wanted to make a comment or question, because I'm going to wrap up. No hands. Okay, so as we close this conversation, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining at the end of the day. I think it's a difficult part of the day to have such a loaded conversation, but thanks for engaging me. In closing, what would you like to leave our audience with? I'll go the same way that I started, Liaan, in being a CFO, but using entrepreneurial skills.
I kind of mentioned it earlier. I think we should all kind of take a mindset of how can we improve, how can we change things, be willing to have a go. That's not something that's unique. I mean, some of us maybe are more risk averse than others, but you can train yourself to have a go, even in small ways and then in bigger ways. Push yourself and your team is what I would say. I think the biggest thing in terms of entrepreneurs, if you can foster that skill within a wider team, and I like what Brett said earlier in terms of encouraging his team to consistently look at and find those new things in those different ways, optimizing sorts of things. And sometimes it's big things, and oftentimes, more often than not, they are actually small things, but incrementally add up to make a big difference. So I would say, you know, just have a go, have a punt, learn from your mistakes, and have fun as well.
Have a jaw. Thank you so much, Liaan. Thank you for joining me. Sizwe.
I think just to build on what you've just said is that as well, you know, paying attention to detail is always important. You know, just sorting out those little things, getting them right. It does help, you know, to create a bigger picture. And, you know, you need to also have probably an eye for talent. You need to make sure that you bring in the right people who will be able to support you and be able to make sure that you achieve your targets. You know, being an entrepreneurial CFO or being in that environment, I think you don't necessarily have to do bigger things like what we do in deals. You know, simple things like looking at some of the value chain, looking at your processes and see where you can cut costs. That does improve profitability. You know, networking, like basically what you guys are doing today, coming into such events where then you can pick up certain, you know, like,
tips.
I mean, such as you've been listening to us, you know, certain tips on how to do whatever you do. I always say to my team that, you know what, basic kind of cash management skills, liquidity management is always key. In that, you know, we operate, for example, we operate in a very, very seasonal environment where we depend on dividends. You know, one year you've got dividends, the other year you don't have dividends. So cash management for any entrepreneur is key. Is key.
Thank you so much, Sizwe, for joining us. I appreciate your presence, Brett. Save the best for last.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So, I mean, my thinking around it is very much around the question, are entrepreneurs born or can you learn to be an entrepreneur? I think in my experience, there are a lot born, but for me personally, I learned, and that was by putting my hand up for a role or roles outside of the CFO function. So I run a few of the operating units, as well as being a CFO. So my sort of charge to you is don't be scared. As finance people, you have great skills, more than you actually know. And I think a lot of us are just conditioned not to put ourselves out there. Put yourself out there. I remember the CEO saying to me, he says, I know you probably don't know how to do this, and I've seen potential, but just go and have a go. Yeah, but you've got to be willing to actually take some sort of risk. Yep. Being an entrepreneur comes with some risk and reward trade-off. So if you're in a corporate, be an entrepreneur, put your hand up to do things you're not doing now. And honestly, it's the best thing I've ever done. The finance part is okay. The running businesses is such fun. It really is. Has its ups and downs, but when it gets right and the people, it's just the best ever. So good luck.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. A round of applause for my panelists, please.